Hello, Ms. Acton. Today we're going to talk about aerobic respiration. And so there are two types of respiration when we talk about cellular respiration. The first one is aerobic respiration, and that uses oxygen. The second one that we're going to talk about is called anaerobic respiration. And when you put the prefix "an" in front of the word, it means not. So aerobic respiration uses energy, anaerobic respiration does not. Aerobic respiration, uses oxygen. So if you think about when you do aerobic exercise, part of aerobics is you do a lot of movement. But the reason that you do a lot of movement is the point is cardio. You're getting your heart going. Your heart is beating faster. You're breathing heavier. And when you're breathing heavier, you're taking in more oxygen. And you're doing that. You're taking in more oxygen so that you can supply enough energy to the muscles that are moving while you're exercising. All right, so aerobic respiration has 3 steps. We're going to try to go through this kind of briefly. It is a fairly complicated process, and we are, like I said, just going through the basics. In step 1, the name of step 1 is glycolysis. So if you remember before, we said the word lyse or lysis means to break. The lysosomes are the part of the cell that break down old cell parts. And so lyse means to break. And if you look at the word that's in front of that, I see the word glucose in there. So glycolysis means to break glucose. And so what's happening in step 1 is the sugar is breaking in half. And so the point of cell respiration is to take the sugar in the food that you eat and break it down to give off energy. Now, in photosynthesis, it took energy from the sun to build the molecule. When we break the molecule, that energy is then given off. So when sugar is broken in the first step, glycolysis, the first thing that's made is 2-ATP. This is occurring in the cytoplasm, and I'm going to jump down to the why. The reason that part 1 is occurring in the cytoplasm is that sugar is actually too big to enter the mitochondria on its own. And since the sugar can't make it into the mitochondria, it's too big, it breaks in half in the cytoplasm first, and then each half sugar is then small enough to fit into the mitochondria. Part 1 said glycolysis is going to happen anytime sugar is present. So your body does not wait to process sugar. Just think about if you give a little kid some sugar, they have instant energy. So anytime that sugar is in the cells, it's going to start to break down. It's going to immediately go through the process of glycolysis. So now what we're going to talk about is what goes in and what comes out. So the reactants and the products. If you look at the little diagram down below, and I purposely have this divided into thirds so you can follow what's happening, what we're starting with in the process of glycolysis, the only arrow that's entering, is glucose. The point of glycolysis is to break the sugar, so we're going to start with glucose. What we're going to end with is 2 half sugars, because we're going to break that sugar in half. Each half sugar would have a formula of C3H6O3. And those 2 half sugars will eventually go on and be used over here in step 2. That's why the arrow goes that way. Those 2 half sugars also have a proper name. So the proper technical name for the half sugar is called pyruvic acid. And sometimes that's shortened to pyruvate. So what we end up with after glycolysis is 2 half sugars, also called pyruvates or pyruvic acid. And we end up with a little bit of energy, 2 charged batteries, ATP. I'm going to just give you a heads up. 2 ATP is not enough energy to keep your cells alive. So if you only have 2 ATP being produced, it's not enough. It's not sustainable. You're going to need more than that. So we go on to step 2. We take our half sugars, and those half sugars are going to get broken down even further. And the name of step 2 is the Krebs Cycle. The name comes from the name of a scientist who figured out the chemical pathways and what's happening in the Krebs cycle. I believe he won the Nobel Prize for this. This is happening in the mitochondria, and it's going to happen whenever that pyruvate, that half sugar, is present. Again, your body doesn't wait to process sugar. It just immediately starts to break it down whenever it's present. What's happening in the Krebs cycle is the sugar is going to break down, and when the sugar is broken down, that's going to give off energy, and that energy is going to be used to charge batteries. Unfortunately, it's going to charge the wrong batteries. I'll explain that in 1 second. So if you look at what goes in and what comes out in part 2, look at the reactants and the products. So the arrow that goes into the Krebs cycle here, the Krebs cycle is occurring in this pink thing is the mitochondria. So the Krebs cycle is occurring in the mitochondria, and we're starting with our half sugar. And our half sugar is going to get broken apart, and it's actually going to be 3 separate carbon dioxide molecules. That process of breaking apart the half sugar into carbon dioxides gives off a little bit of ATP. So we make 2 ATP. Again, that's not enough to keep your cells alive. But when it also breaks apart, it gives off lots and lots of energy to charge these batteries. These batteries are NADH and FADH. Remember, more letters, more energy, or the ones that end in H are the high energy batteries. Unfortunately, these aren't the type of batteries that your cell needs. Your cell needs ATP. But have you ever used a battery to charge a battery? So the battery that you needed was dead, and you had another battery, and you were able to charge the first battery with the second battery, even though the second battery was charged, it wasn't the one you needed. That's kind of what's happening here. Okay, so in the Krebs cycle, energy is given off by breaking down the half sugar, and it's going to charge these batteries, the wrong batteries. But in step 3, we're going to use the fully charged wrong batteries to charge the right battery, which is going to be ATP. All right, last step, step 3. Step 3 is called the electron transport chain, and this is where most of our ATP is made. In this case, we're going to make 32 ATP. If you're keeping track, it's going to be a total of 36. So 32 plus 2 plus 2 means in this whole process of glycolysis, we're going to have a total of 36 ATP. And this is occurring on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And step 3 requires oxygen to be present. So step 3 can only occur when oxygen is present. And this is actually the reason that you die from a lack of oxygen. What's happening here is we're going to make ATP, the right battery, from NADH and FADH2, which are the wrong batteries. So if we look at our reactants in our products, I'm actually going to adjust this slightly. So what goes in here is oxygen and charged batteries. And actually, they go over here as well. Okay, so what's entering this cycle is oxygen gas and our charged batteries, NADH and FADH. Those are our fully charged wrong batteries. So we're going to take the energy from these batteries along with some oxygen. The oxygen is going to pick up some hydrogens along the way and turn into water. And the energy from our fully charged battery is going to create 32 ATP. Once we use the energy from NADH and FADH, they'll no longer be charged. They'll be dead batteries, and so they'll go back to the Krebs cycle, and they'll get charged there, and then they'll get used to make ATP, and then they'll get charged in the Krebs cycle and used to make ATP, and so those two batteries will just cycle around. Our 32 ATP will go and be used for all sorts of other cell processes. All right. So the main things you need to know are the names of the stages, how many ATP are made in each stage, and the reactants and the products for each stage. Okay. Hopefully you were following along. Hopefully this made sense. And please check back to Google Classroom and make sure that you do part 3.